I'm going to welcome everybody to this session. It's part of a longer session, of a longer series of sessions. We are inviting people from the Middle East to, or leading experts on the Middle East from abroad, to give us their own views and ideas. We had the last time we have Raiba Aratawi from Amman, and today we are very honored and very happy to have Yossi Alpher with us. It's an old friend of our center, and this is very honoring to us. Yossi has a great experience both in the government, in the security services, and in the army, and also it has been in very important posts as a director of the at that time I think or it was the Jaffee Center, now the Institute of National Security Studies, and also he's one of the very inspiring founders of Bitter Lemons initiative, which I found very important, and it's part of the curriculum for my students. When we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So what we are going to do is to have a talk by Yossi Alpher, and then the four members of the panel, me, myself, Zaki Akra, and Stavros Dapouliarakos, and perhaps also Marina Eleftheriadou, if she's available. We can make some questions to Yossi. Yossi, the floor is yours. We are looking forward to hear you.
Thank you very much, Sotiris, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. You've given me a really challenging task because there are so many different strategic aspects of the current conflict between Israel and Hamas. It goes far beyond that throughout the Middle East to the great powers and so on. I think even looking at the mistakes that have been made, there's material for at least 3 commissions of inquiry in Israel if and when this is over. I'll try to touch on all the vital issues. I know I'll miss something, and that's why I'm depending on you folks to catch me on the issues I miss and to bring them up in the question period. I also have to note we're in the midst of this event, and it's very hard to reach any hard and fast conclusions at the strategic level. This is more like an interim report, I would say. I mean, I hope it's near the end, but there's absolutely no way to predict that. Let me start by just touching on the current focal points. If I turn on the TV news or open the newspaper in the morning, what's on the agenda? U.S.-Israel relations against the backdrop of all of the controversial issues related to the war, the hostage talks currently in recess, the notion of an IDF offensive in Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip, the Lebanese front, which is in danger of heating up and becoming the main arena of warfare. The fact that the IDF deployment in Gaza has actually been radically reduced to no more than 1 division from an initial 4. And the fact that there's little movement on the ground right now. We're kind of in a period of muddling through, which can, of course, end any moment. We are Israel is engaged in multi-front war, all on all fronts, relatively low-level warfare, all fronts from Yemen to Lebanon, and this I can't emphasize enough. This is a country in trauma. We suffered a trauma on October 7th, and we're still focused on October 7th. We understand that the rest of the world is not. The rest of the world is focused on Rafah. It's focused on more than 30,000 dead in the Gaza Strip. We are still traumatized by the events of October 7th, which from the Israeli and Jewish standpoint have to sit somewhere between the Holocaust and the pogroms of the turn of the 20th century, the pogroms in Russia and Ukraine. This is the sense that Israelis have of this, and we fully realize, or we should realize, that the rest of the world does not see it this way, but the rest of the world has to realize that we do see it this way. Let me just by way of illustration, take something from this morning's newspaper. A member of Knesset for the Likud, a backbencher named Amit Halevi, writes a letter to the prime minister addressing Netanyahu's claims that we're heading for total victory, and offers a score sheet for what is Israel achieving and what is Hamas achieving. And this is a Likudnik. And on his score sheet, Hamas is winning. Hamas says the success, I'm quoting from him, from Amit Halevi, successful surprise on October 7th, having succeeded in amplifying the demand for a Palestinian state, having recruited Western intellectual backing for its cause against Israel, using the hostage issue to divide Israeli society, forcing Israel to evacuate along two borders, Gaza and Lebanon, more than somewhere around 100,000 people, generating Israel's international isolation and the boycott of Israel. What does he credit Netanyahu with? Generating a national spirit of volunteering and the IDF's achievements, such as they are. This is a Likudnik, and it's very uncharacteristic of the kind of what we usually hear from Likudniks. But I would suggest that it may be a harbinger of things to come, and certainly is a commentary on the course of the war and the effect on Israeli politics. Let me backtrack now for some strategic insights on the period before the war that led up to the war. Israel was in, again, before October 7th, Israel was in the throes of a Likud attempt at judicial reform, which was extremely controversial and generating massive demonstrations and riots in Israel. The most right-wing religious messianic government we have ever had was busy trying to absorb the West Bank, settle it, do everything to put the final nail in the coffin of any attempt to establish a Palestinian state. On the other side, the Palestinian issue, or the Palestinians were in a state of virtual dysfunctionality, particularly in the West Bank. They were being ignored by the Sunni Arab world. Saudi Arabia was on the verge of normalizing relations with Israel, basically by ignoring or paying lip service, no more than that, to the Palestinian issue, just as the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco had done a couple of years earlier. The Netanyahu government was fostering what was called or in retrospect is called a conceptia, what Netanyahu himself called economic peace vis-a-vis Hamas in Gaza. The idea was to cultivate the Hamas, the Gazan economy. The thought was that if the Gazans are satisfied and have full stomachs, they won't give us any trouble. So we worked together with Qatar to bring funds into the Gaza Strip. The idea was if we can cultivate Hamas in Gaza, then we are dividing the Palestinian polity between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah's PLO in the West Bank, and they will have no chance of advancing the proposition of a Palestinian state. This was Netanyahu's concept. If you go back and look at the 2008 elections, he actually ran on a platform called Economic Peace in Gaza. The Hamas tunnels were known about, but were dismissed as unimportant. We basically knew only about a third of them. We were thinning our defenses against Hamas, along the border of the Gaza Strip, in favor of protecting a very active, energetic settlement movement in the West Bank, sponsored by this right-wing messianic government, and particularly its religious parties. The fence along the Gaza Strip, above and below the ground, was not being maintained because there was no sense of danger whatsoever. We had bought off Hamas. This was the concept on the eve of October 7th. What happened on October 7th reflected a masterful strategic plan and execution by Hamas. The objectives, as far as we can, we understand them. Hamas's objectives, as far as we understand them, were, first of all, in view of the timing, to thwart any Saudi move toward normalization with Israel. From an Islamic standpoint, this was considered very important by Hamas. To grasp regional and global jihadi leadership, to defend Al-Aqsa, that is what we call the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, presented by Hamas as a symbol of Israel's evil intentions toward the Islamic world, to grasp leadership of the Palestinian National Movement away from the PLO, to inspire or push the axis of resistance. This is the Iran-led Islamist alliance of Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, various Shiite Islamist militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen, to inspire them to join in a joint offensive against Israel. To the extent that Israeli intelligence had any inkling of what was going to happen, the assumption was, if there's an attack on us, it's an attack by the entire axis of resistance. If you go back and look on October 7th, the reserve call-up, which was of hundreds of thousands of Israelis, the reserve call-up, fully half of the reserves who were called up were first sent to the Northern Front, that is to the Israel-Lebanon border, facing Hezbollah, because of the IDF was certain we were going to be attacked from there, and that would be the main front. In this sense, it was a failure for Hamas that it attacked alone. And it found itself alone, and has found itself virtually alone since then. Symbolic efforts by Hezbollah, by the Houthis, but nothing like what Hamas expected and what the IDF anticipated. The Hamas used atrocities as part of its shock strategy. I'm talking about the the murder of 1,200 Israelis on October 7th, or on or about October 7th, the rape and mutilation of the women, as we understand it, a deliberate effort by Hamas to shock and to shock us into an inability to function. The hostage taking was clear that Hamas made full preparations, having knocked down the fence to take hundreds of Israeli hostages, because here we get to another of Hamas's goals, which is to force Israel to free all or most of the thousands of Hamas prisoners in Israeli jails. As an intelligence veteran myself, I tend to focus on the Israeli intelligence mistakes, and here you have to go back to October 6th, 1973, when the Yom Kippur War began with the Egyptian and Syrian attack, to find something similar in terms of strategic intelligence surprise hitting Israel. And in this case, the failure of our intelligence establishment to anticipate this is shocking, and it's clearly going to be the subject of a lot of inquiries. The heads of Israeli intelligence have already indicated that at some point they will be resigning, but the overall blame has to fall on Prime Minister Netanyahu, because it was his strategic concept of economic peace with Hamas in Gaza that in effect set the tone for Israeli intelligence to downplay any dangers of attack by Hamas, and the Israeli military and the Shin Bet internal intelligence service to simply neglect the defenses around the Gaza Strip. You go on from here to the beginning of the war, again talking about intelligence mistakes. Because we neglected Gaza, we neglected to collect intelligence on Hamas, its leadership, and the tunnels it had been digging. So we begin the war with an attempt to bomb and destroy the tunnels from the air, which takes a huge toll in the lives of Palestinians in Gaza. Now, we can go to the international courts and defend ourselves. These were legitimate targets to destroy these tunnels, but we really had no clue how deep the tunnels were, how extensive they were, and the bombing was therefore less than fully effective. And it's very hard to justify the toll in human lives vis-a-vis the relative lack of damage that our bombing did. We also went into this war with no concept of how to deal with the humanitarian aspect. Indeed, you have Israeli generals on October 7th and 8th saying we're going to starve the Gazans into submission. Talking about 2-point-something million civilians in Gaza. And obviously, this was only a negative contribution to the current situation. The bottom line is today, 6 months later, most of the Hamas leadership has apparently survived. We can claim to have decimated 80% of the Hamas terrorist army, but not to get rid of them all, because wherever we clean out an area and move on, they pop up behind us again. Classic guerrilla tactics that they've read Che Guevara, and they know how to manage warfare using classic guerrilla tactics. Now, how does this all this affect Israeli politics? It's rather astounding. The coalition of 64, which by any international standard of the way democracies function, in having suffered this kind of surprise attack and failure in warfare, the coalition of 64 members of Knesset out of 120 is holding. Not a single member of Knesset, including this guy who today waved his list of Hamas achievements and Israeli failures, not a single one is saying, I can't support this government anymore. They are trying to divert the blame to the military, to the Shin Bet, every tactic possible to avoid having to go to new elections and submit themselves to the popular will, postponing appointment of a commission of inquiry, which in the Israeli tradition is the next logical step. Not yet allowing the heads of the security echelon to resign, using today Rafah as an excuse for extending the war, and all of this in an atmosphere of a great patriotic atmosphere in Israel, total dedication to the war, the popular will is totally behind the government demand to destroy Hamas, which appears to be impossible, by the way, but that's certainly where the public is today. The country, as a result of October 7th, has moved to the right. We were already on the right. We already had a right religious coalition. All the polls indicate the popular will has moved even further to the right. The left, the so-called peace camp, which was weak when this war began, has been totally decimated. And all this we still anticipate the danger of a very destructive war with Hezbollah, and Hezbollah means Iran. And a war with Hezbollah, I'm sure you're aware of the rockets which Hamas has fired at Tel Aviv and everything basically between Tel Aviv and the Gaza Strip and Beersheba and the Negev. Hezbollah has a far greater capacity to fire rockets and missiles at the entire territory of Israel, north and south. A war with Hezbollah will be far more damaging. And Hezbollah is deterred at this point. The fact is they didn't join in as Hamas hoped and anticipated and planned, but this is still a tit-for-tat situation on our northern border, which could easily escalate into something worse, which means that if that happens, we'll look back 6 months from now at this juncture and say, yes, well, this was an interim report before the real war began. The real war between Israel and Hezbollah with Iran's backing in Lebanon. It hasn't happened yet, but it's by no means a certainty that we will emerge from this crisis without a serious war with Hezbollah. Throughout all of this, and I go back even to the pre-October 7th period, I go back 50 years. We have never had a coherent strategy for dealing with the Gaza Strip. Israel has never had a strategy for dealing with whether it's Hamas or anybody else in the Gaza Strip. And that of course remains the situation today, with President Biden begging Netanyahu to present a plan for after the war, for what happens to Gaza after the war, and Netanyahu not able to answer him, not willing to answer him, pressured by right-wingers who want to hold on to the Gaza Strip, but basically having no coherent strategy for what you do with Gaza when this is over. I have to remind you here, we go all the way back to the Oslo Accords, 93, 94, when we and the world presented elaborate plans to turn the Gaza Strip into a Singapore. It will have an airport, it will have a naval port, it will have high tech, or whatever we called high tech in 1993. It has all the conditions for being developed in this way. And indeed, when we moved into the Oslo Accords, for a brief period of time, Gaza had an airport and it had a seaport. And all these plans were launched and got nowhere, because Oslo gave the Palestinians a fair opportunity at state building in Gaza, and they completely failed. And the PLO failed, Hamas took over, and it's been downhill ever since. And I have to tell you, I'm very skeptical about all the plans we hear in the international, at the international level, about how Gaza can be developed once this war is over. We failed again and again. The Palestinians have failed, and the outlook is, to say the least, bleak. Now, turning to the international aspect, first of all, the United States, President Biden, who dramatically stood by us on and after October 7th, is now confronting Netanyahu over the civilian losses in the Gaza Strip, the humanitarian aspect, a warning not to try to move into Rafah, and even here and there hinting at holding up military aid for Israel. He is still backing Israel on the hostage issue, which is key and extremely important. But it's fair to say that under Netanyahu, Israeli-American relations have entered a kind of crisis, with the United States basically being the only actor on the international scene that's still standing with us in any way. We look around the map, Western democracies turning against us in various degrees, various boycotts, warnings, demands to enforce international law with regard to the losses in Gaza, a great deal of concern over the humanitarian issue, and basically the Israeli failure under Netanyahu to deal with it adequately, not just now, but going back to the very beginning of this war. Russia and Turkey, two countries with which we've traditionally had fairly good relations and strategic coordination, have turned completely against Israel from the get-go. From October 7th, they backed Hamas, they backed the Hamas narrative. They never condemned the Hamas attack. The only ray of light you can see at the international level is, of course, relative. But note that not a single Arab country that had relations with us prior to October 7th has broken those relations. Egypt, Jordan, Egypt in particular has been extremely cooperative because Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood, and Egypt has its own scores to settle with it. But even Jordan, where there's more than 50% of the population is of Palestinian extraction, there's huge agitation against Israel, but it has not broken relations. Not to mention the UAE, which still has air traffic back and forth to Israel. It's rather astounding given the level of anger in the Arab world and identification in the Arab world with Hamas in this war, if there's any sign of danger here from the Israeli standpoint, it's that Jordan will buckle and sever relations. But in the meantime, Jordan still buys water from us, and still Jordan and Egypt still cooperate at the security level against shared enemies. This is rather astounding, given the course of this war and the level of agitation against Israel in the Middle East. The damage we've done to the Gaza Strip, the losses, the huge losses we've inflicted on Hamas, I think may be said at the broad strategic level to have enhanced Israeli deterrence, although this remains to be seen. But it seems to me that our enemies in the Arab world, or enemies in the Middle East, led by Iran, including Hezbollah, look at what's going on in Gaza and say, we don't want this for ourselves, which is why we're not attacking Israel in any serious, meaningful, strategic sense. And that includes even the Houthis, who are bothering the rest of the world at Bab el-Mandeb, but have not succeeded. Not a single one of their missiles has actually reached Israel. Let me try to summarize with 5 questions. And when we began, I said there are going to be more questions than answers. But I hope the questions embody what's preoccupying us these days. First of all, how did it come to this? And will this pass? How did it come to this that we have succeeded in alienating most of the world? And given that this war will end at some point, how quickly, if at all, do we get back to business as usual with the world? Or are we stigmatized until further notice? My own inclination is to say, basically, the world gets back to business pretty quickly and puts wars like this and humanitarian catastrophes like this behind it. But I don't know. We're asking ourselves. Question number 2. What is the influence of anti-Semitism in the global attitude toward Israel over this war? We Israelis look at Hamas. Hamas is an anti-Semitic movement. Hamas believes in destroying the Jews and destroying the Jewish state. Hamas has no compunctions about preaching against the Jews in its mosque. But looking beyond that, to the global reaction, to the Muslim reaction in the Middle East, and to the global reaction, what is the role of anti-Semitism? When you see people in the West adopting Hamas and supporting the Hamas cause and chanting from the river to the sea, people who couldn't find us on the map, adopting these slogans, we Israelis tend to be paranoid about this, and to believe that there's a lot of this is anti-Semitism. And it's always been there, and it's popping up again at a time of crisis. But I don't have an answer to this. What is the role of anti-Semitism? And if so, what is the significance? Third question, and this very much is an internal Israeli question. From our standpoint, is the primary objective of this war to free the hostages, because this is a national trauma for Israel, or to defeat Hamas? And they are not necessarily synonymous. Where you put the emphasis. the events of October 7th, the fact that several hundred Israelis were taken hostage, only a small portion have been freed, others are dying almost as we speak. They're subject to unspeakable horrors. They're hit deep down below the surface in tunnels. For many Israelis, the first objective of the war has to be to free them, because that's what Israel is about or is supposed to be about. Israel is the national home of the Jewish people, and its institutions are supposed to prevent things like this happening to the Jewish people. That was supposed to be a part of the pre-state past, that Jews were subject to pogroms like this. And here it happened, and it has to be corrected. That's one approach to the war. Another is to say, no, we have to defeat Hamas, because if we don't defeat Hamas, Hamas will come back to sting us again. It might take it 10 or 20 years to recover. But what Hamas is all about is destroying Israel. And that has to be the main objective of the war. This is an open question. Fourth question, why is Israel, at least as we understand it, losing the international media war? What's wrong with our ability to present our case? Where have we failed? Where have our friends failed? Why is the media situation, the image situation so bad when we look at the way the world is addressing this war? And fifth, exactly 50 years and a day before October 7th was the Yom Kippur attack of October 6, 1973. Is this something that's gonna, is it in our DNA to be subjected to this kind of strategic surprise once every 50 years? Because somehow we let our guard down and we fail ourselves. It certainly it gives us food for thought. To summarize, this is a country in trauma. It's still in trauma. And our friends or enemies should recognize that trauma is at the heart of a lot of our behavior and our reaction to events. This is a country with over 100,000 of its citizens displaced, evacuated from its borders for the first time since 1948, since our War of Independence. This has never happened before. We are suffering economically, and yet we are still under the same government and the same security establishment that were in place 6 months ago when this disaster began. Beyond that, at the broader level, I think this war and the internal events in Israel that it has sparked hasten what I consider to be our slow descent down a slippery slope toward some sort of a binational entity together with the Palestinians, but not a democratic binational entity. This is, I think, where we were heading before the war. It seems to me the war and the outcome of the war are going to hasten this process of descent down this very ugly, slippery slope toward a very ugly and violent reality between the river and the sea, between Israelis and Palestinians. I think we're also, and this is apropos the fact that the Sunni Arab world that had been establishing relations with us when this began, and which has not broken with us, we're resembling it more and more with regard to democracy in Israel, to the religious messianic components in our society. We're looking more and more like our neighbors. And I'm not happy to say that, and I'm not happy with that development, but that's the way things look. There's no end in sight at this point for Israeli occupation of Gaza in one form or another, with war, without war, for Israeli domestic and political distortions that have been generated by this war, and for global anger at Israel over the casualty rate and the humanitarian issues in this war. I think with that, I will end my presentation and be happy to invite your comments and questions.
Mr. Russos, your mic. You have
Turn
to
my
answer.
mic off?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Alpher, you're
Fine.
fine.
Thank you very much. It is for this most enlightening talk, which actually give us in a very bright way, in a way that we can understand it, the standpoint from Israel. Now, thank you very much for this. I have two questions, and I'm going to, let's say, exploit my position as a moderator to take the floor. My two questions is this. First is that some analysts have said that the 7th of October attack of Hamas has an impact on the Israeli society and on the Israeli political elite, similar, if not the same, with what happened with September 11th in the US. And this might change the course of the Israeli strategic thinking towards both the Palestinians and the world. Actually, the course of events as far as the September 11th is concerned, I think we are not that positive for the that beneficial for the Americans. My opinion is that we are not beneficial at all with Iraq and Afghanistan, what happened there. Now, what do you think? Do you think that there will be a change in the strategic paradigm in Israel after this event? Do you think that something can change? Not now. You said very eloquently that you are in a in a state of trauma now, and it's very difficult for changing the strategic paradigms in the state of trauma. But do you think that there is a possibility for changing the strategic paradigm of Israel? I'm more, let's say, what I mean with this is that I have the impression that after the second Intifada, Israel thought that with the technological and military superiority and with the relations with some of the Arab states, could handle the Palestinian issue there. So there is no reason of even thinking about the Palestinian issue as an issue. Do you think that this can change now? And towards what direction? I mean, there might be different directions. The second is something more.
Let me address your first, if I may.
Okay. All right.
Because you put the thoughts in my head. Look, first of all, I remind you of Biden's visit to Israel shortly after October 7th. I think he came on October 11th. And he made a speech here. And he warned us. He warned us, don't make the mistakes we Americans made after 9/11. Stop and think before you act. And he was referring to Iraq and Afghanistan and to the US mistakes there. And he was, I mean, he was telling us, think before you attack the Gaza Strip. what things are going to look like somewhere down the line. And that warning fell on deaf ears because we went into Gaza. It's very well known. We had and we have no plan for what to do with Gaza after we reconquer it. Again, and I mentioned that the history of not having a strategy for the Gaza Strip. You never did. And so Biden warned us, and that warning was ignored. That's point number one. The second point is Israeli public opinion, which was not in favor of a Palestinian state before this war, is now far more opposed to even talking to the Palestinians about a state or anything else. The anger at the Palestinians on the street in Israel is far greater now than it was before the war. There's no one to talk to. Look, the kibbutz residents who lived around the Gaza Strip, the so-called Gaza Periphery, on the eve of the war, were among the most active peace camp in Israel. They did things like pick up sick Gazans at the crossing points and escort them to hospitals in Israel for humanitarian reasons, for peace reasons, because they believed in this. The kibbutzim around the Gaza Strip come from a socialist heritage, which has fed into the Israeli peace camp. You talk to those people today, they want nothing to do with the Gazans, nothing whatsoever. Their hearts are closed, sealed against them. So this is, I mean, now some of these effects might change over time, but I mean, this is my short-term answer to your question. I don't compare this to 9/11 so much, but I certainly recognize that the strategic effect on Israel's behavior is on a level with 9/11 and the mistakes made by the Americans in the aftermath of 9/11.
Hold on again. I have to do this. Sorry, it's my fault as a host.
So, Tiris, you had another question.
Sorry, it's okay. My second question has to do with domestic politics in Israel.
Has to do with what? Sorry?
Domestic politics in Israel.
Right.
Domestic politics. There is a view in United States and in Europe and in Greece that the biggest obstacle to any, let's say, positive, whatever positive you call it, is from the part of Israel, is Netanyahu himself. That if we get rid of Netanyahu, then most of the problems will be resolved. I'm not of those who are supporting very much this view, but I would like to hear your view about it.
Look, I've never been a supporter of Netanyahu, ever. The feeling on October 7th was indeed something close to what you're describing. This is Netanyahu's fault. If we get rid of him, we can correct things. Now, Netanyahu is without a doubt, and I say this with no love lost for the man, but he is without a doubt the smartest politician in Israel, and maybe one of the smartest in the world. Because if you compare his situation today to what it was 6 months ago, he looks like a survivor. I mean, 6 months ago, most of the political pundits were saying he's finished. It's just he has to resign now or soon, or he'll be toppled. The people will demonstrate and topple him. He's still around. He hasn't lost a single one of his 64 members of Knesset. So first of all, I'm answering to those who say if you just get rid of Netanyahu, well, we're not so getting rid of Netanyahu so quickly. That's what emerges right now, and he is masterful at manipulating the situation to stay in power, to postpone commissions of inquiry, to postpone elections, and hope that he can change his image. I mean, mind you, the public is totally against Netanyahu. The same Israeli public that is moved to the right of Netanyahu, blames him, still blames him and wants him out. But there's no leader on the political scene who emerges as the obvious replacement for him. And we're talking about replacements from the center right, because that's where Israeli politics are now, not on the left. So there's no obvious replacement. And it's not clear if and when he's going to go. And having said all that, I now address your question. Let's say tomorrow he resigns, or a commission of inquiry, which will take a couple of years, forces him to resign, or he submits to new elections and loses. Israeli politics in the post-Netanyahu era are going to be right-wing, religious, racist. I'm sorry to say. Who will emerge to lead? I don't know, but I'm very pessimistic about the outlook. I would, of course, be delighted to be proven wrong, to see someone emerge who can unite all of us, or a majority of Israelis, at the center of politics, if not the left, at least at the center, but move us away from the right, more secular, less religious. Right now, I don't see the building blocks for that kind of a political change in Israel in a post-Netanyahu era, nor do I see when the post-Netanyahu era is going to begin.
Okay, thank you. Now, I give the
I'd
floor
like to
to the rest
Yeah.
of, sorry, okay.
I'm
Yeah.
eager. Yeah, and
Would
then I'll give the floor to
like to
Stavros
start,
Ministry.
and
Yeah. I will start.
okay.
So again, thank you very much, Mr. Alpher, for your always great way of depicting of what's happening in Israel. So my question is, well, I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to shrink them as much as I can. My first question is that you mentioned, I mean, repeatedly, there was no plan for Gaza. I mean, for ever since we've been studying Israel. Indeed, that's one of the wonders of the strategy of Israel. There was never really a plan for Gaza. But what would you say was the plan for the West Bank, especially for the last 15 years? And I'm asking this because we know for a fact that prior to 7 of October, Hamas's popularity in Gaza was decreased because of corruption, because of a zillion reasons that we could go into it, right? But we see that the popularity of Hamas to some extent, or at least, if not for Hamas per se, for a more, armed struggle against, occupation, is becoming more vivid in the occupied territories of the West Bank. So we haven't spoken at all about the situation in the West Bank, not only since October the 7th, but also to what was the plan, which also went bad. I mean, some people argue that the attacks and the savagery conducted by Hamas in says how many months ago was basically a war of relevance, precisely because it lost relevance, because it saw rival armed groups taking its place into the struggle against occupation. So what would you say Israel failed also in the West Bank that led to the phenomenon of the increase of popularity for armed struggle? But also I wanted to ask whether, especially in the Gaza envelope, is the people, the ones left in Israel from the peace camp, and we know that a large part of the peace camp within Israel has left the country, literally. And one of the most pressing points that they used to say prior to 7/10 is that one day we're going to pay for the violence that we've been, conducting to the Palestinian people, whether in Gaza, and especially in Gaza because of the siege, but also in the West Bank. So, I mean, I'm still surprised to a large extent that this has not come up. I understand the trauma. And as a Palestinian, I think that this trauma, as unfortunate as it is, it will bring the two people closer together, at least in the long run. I know it looks bleak right now, but we need to tell ourselves this so we can move on, okay? But, but what I want to say is that these very same people, the very few that were left behind, were the ones that were warning against such events precisely because of the violence that was, imposed. So I don't know what you have to say about that, and then I would like to know your, your insights regarding the Palestinian Authority, and perhaps a little bit about whether you see Israel releasing Marwan Barghouti, of hearing a lot of hearsay about that. So there goes the number of questions loaded out there for you.
Okay, it's hard for me to keep track. Look,
I can repeat whatever point you
no,
need.
let's start with the West Bank. In the past, you said the past 15 years, which is a good frame because those are Netanyahu years. Netanyahu, who took over from Olmert, who is the last Israeli to engage in an attempt at two-state solution negotiations with Abu Mazen, with the PLO. Back in 2008. I'm not going to go into the reasons for that failure, but it failed. And Netanyahu, who under pressure from various American presidents has paid lip service to the notion of a two-state solution, more or less in the past 15 years has stopped doing that and abandoned that. And as his coalitions became more and more extreme, leading up to the current one, and especially in the current one, he's completely abandoned any notion of lip service to a two-state solution. His coalition partners are bent on swallowing up all or most of the West Bank. And they talk until this war only in terms of the West Bank, not the Gaza Strip, because Gaza was economic peace. It was divide and rule. It was pacified. Every few years there was a flare-up of rockets, but not something we couldn't live with. Now you had in this war the right religious elements in Netanyahu's coalition all of a sudden rediscovering Gaza, which is rather interesting in terms of settlement. They had a big convention to talk about settling Gaza. I don't know if you followed Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, all of a sudden talking about, the Gaza Mediterranean coast is prime real estate. We can develop it. What's interesting here, if you talk to religious Jews, the Gaza Strip was never part of the land of Israel. The biblical land of Israel, the promised land, was never part of it, which was why it was so easy, relatively easy, for Arik Sharon in 2005 to lead our withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. He could say to the religious settlers there, this is not the land of Israel. Go somewhere else in the land of Israel. And all of a sudden, this is forgotten about. And you've got these people. Now, I don't take this talk very seriously. I think here the international community, and particularly the United States, will prevent any move by extremist Israelis toward holding on to, in the long term, holding on to coveted territories in the Gaza Strip. But the West Bank, if you followed what's happened in the last 6 months, the same extreme right-wing religious elements in the Netanyahu government have been pushing their settlement project in the West Bank frantically on the assumption that the world is preoccupied with Gaza and they can get away with land grabs in the West Bank on a greater and greater extent. They are helped in this by the disarray in the Palestinian camp. Abu Mazen at age, I think it's 88 at last count, has almost no popular support in the West Bank at all, at least according to Khalil Shikaki's surveys, and I put stock in them. Has almost no support, and it's not clear what the succession will be. The Abu Mazen and the PA and the PLO have made it clear that they do not identify with Hamas and do not see themselves unifying with Hamas in some new scheme, such as had been put about, including by the Biden government. So at this point, it looks at these efforts at some sort of Palestinian unity to move in the chaos in Gaza appear to be a failure. So now we get to the schemes like Marwan Barghouti, who was once a friend of mine. I have to acknowledge here. I liked the guy. I supported the guy. But how do you address these hopes that are pinned on releasing someone who's been in Israeli jail for what, 15 years? I don't remember, 20 years, and boosting him as the leader who's going to unite Palestinians? I find it hard to buy. I think that guys like Jibril Rajoub and Mohammed Dahlan, who have the muscle, who have the influence, who are well set up, are going to either prevent that from happening or just push him aside. I mean, personally, if there's any Palestinian who I think perhaps has a chance to take over leadership from Israel in an occupied Gaza, let's say 3 years, 4 years from now, it's Dahlan, who is a Gazan, who knows how to use power, who ran security services, who is very ambitious. But this is my own personal opinion. I mean, what I think is particularly dismaying is the inability of both of Palestinians, of their Arab neighbors, and of Americans of goodwill in the Biden administration to point to any convincing Palestinian leadership structure that can be installed in the Gaza Strip. But I mean, again, this is an extremely dynamic situation. It's changing all the time. And of course, Abu Mazen is a key factor here. If and when he disappears from the scene, nobody knows what's going to happen.
True. I mean, once the PLO was a terrorist organization with which Israel wanted nothing to do with, especially Arafat. You never know, maybe an emerging Hamas-Fatah coalition, would be something.
I have to stop. Zaki, I have to stop you here.
Why?
Hamas are Islamists. Hezbollah are Islamists. Iran are Islamists. Read their holy books. The scripture they believe in calls upon them. They have to destroy the Jews. They cannot acknowledge a Jewish right to a state anywhere on Waqf land, anywhere. That's a huge area. It's not just here. And here I become less objective and more subjective, I fully admit. What we saw on October 7th was a convincing demonstration of Islamist extremism against Jews. What we've done since then and before then is a series of unforgivable mistakes on our part. But what we saw on October 7th was Islamist extremism. And we look around today and we see in the entire Arab and Islamic world, they have erased October 7th. It never happened. These things never happened. And here I have to quote you one of the Israeli women who investigated the atrocities of October 7th against women, and who said, the people who did this hate Jews and hate women.
This gives me the floor for another question. I mean, and it's really interesting. You mentioned anti-Semitism, and this is a very important point. This is my question, and I'll give the floor to the rest. You know, there is a lot of talk about Semitism, which is a very European phenomenon, right? And a lot of it, especially in the Arab world, and my point of view from the Arab world is that it's really just anti-Zionism instead. However, after the genocide that's been going on, there is actual fears for what you're actually saying, that this might become anti-Semitism. And I was wondering if Israel has a plan regarding that, into mollifying or like trying to open dialogue, into trying to bond and disengage the Israeli state from the notion of Jewishness, because we've seen an intensification of this, especially after, you know, the announcement of the Jewish state of Israel in 2017. I mean, it gets a little bit complicated when, you know, Israel identifies clearly and solely as a Jewish state. I was wondering if any initiatives have been taking place into, you know, trying to deconstruct that a little bit.
Look, I'm a totally secular Jew, okay? I'm an atheist, but I'm a Jew. That's my nationality. That's my history. That's my culture. It's my religion, whether I want it or not. Now, that's what the state of Israel is all about, even for secular Jews. And right now, as I see it, Jewishness in Israel is becoming more religious. Not my Jewishness, but what I see around me. And what I see is taking over Israeli politics. You see it in education. You see it in the army. More and more religion. I'm not happy with this. I'm not happy with this kind of ultra-nationalist religion. It has elements of fascism in it. But this is where we're heading. So, you know, what you're suggesting is right in many ways, but it's not going to happen. It's not at all going to happen. On the contrary, we're moving in the opposite direction.
Okay, so I'm going to thank you very much for a very interesting conversation, which gives us plenty of food for thought, Mr. Alpher. I have two questions. I'm going to move us away more to foreign policy, Israel's foreign policy, towards its periphery and its neighborhood. So I remember some years ago when we first talked, when I was doing when I was researching for my PhD thesis on Turkish-Israeli relations, we talked about the rising periphery nostalgia from Israel. It was a term that you more or less coined at the time for the rise of the rise again of the periphery doctrine of the 1950s in 2010 Israel. So I was wondering if you mentioned that after October 7th, the stance of the Arab countries, and especially the Emirates and Egypt, was more or less restrained towards with regard to the ongoing relations, the ongoing economic ties, and so forth. So would you say that this is a result of a successful resurgence of the periphery doctrine of Israel during the 2010s, or is this something completely different? Because if I remember correctly, the periphery doctrine says that we're going to cultivate ties with potentially friendly states, or we're going to work on those ties in order to not be alone in our neighborhood. And just the second question is very small. It's just a comment that I would like to hear from you.
You folks think I'm able to remember the first question when you finished asking the second? I'll do my best.
Okay,
let me answer this. Let me answer this one first. I'm delighted you brought up the periphery, something we've talked about in the past. When we talked about the periphery, I was able to describe the periphery doctrine in terms of the Arab-Israel conflict, okay? Going back to the 50s and 60s, we were surrounded by a hostile Arab world. Every single Arab country around us, hostile. And we reached out to the non-Arab countries on the outer extremity of the Arab world, like Iran, like Turkey at the time, like Ethiopia. That was the original periphery. When we spoke, if I recall correctly, I was able to talk about something I called the new periphery. Mm-hmm. Why the new periphery? Because in the meantime, fortunately, we had begun to make peace with the parts of the Arab heartland, led particularly by Egypt and Jordan. And then you work in the Oslo Accords, Palestinians as well. So that you couldn't talk about the classic periphery doctrine because it was designed to bring about a situation where the Arab world would make peace with us. The Arab world would see they can't beat us. We have friends in places like Turkey and Iran. We're not going to collapse, and they'll begin to make peace with us. And the case of Egypt, I think, is the classic one, because I think Egypt was very strongly affected in Sadat's peace considerations, not just by the outcome of the Yom Kippur War, but by the fact that we had established a base in the heart of Africa, at the sources of the Nile River, which is the lifeblood of Egypt, in Ethiopia, in Uganda, in South Sudan, and Egypt saw this as a real danger signal that it had better find a way to get along with us. I think it exaggerated, but the periphery really worked to bring about peace with the Arab world. Then you come to a situation where the hostile countries are on the periphery, particularly Iran, but also to some extent Turkey. And the new periphery, which I described, it was my own term, was when we reached out to you folks, to Greece, to Cyprus, and to countries, to the Gulf, to the Emirates, Arab countries. In other words, the periphery is no longer Arab and non-Arab, but it's rather countries who share our concerns about Iran, particularly Iran, but to some extent Turkey as well. That was what one could call a new periphery. And it eventuated in a situation just in the last few years where we began to make normalization arrangements, which were called normalization was a euphemism for peace. Nobody wanted to use the term, but with Morocco, with the UAE, with Bahrain, and when this war began, we were on the verge, apparently, of normalization with Saudi Arabia as well, which is one of the, I think, most convincing explanations for the timing of the Hamas offensive of October 7th. what we end up with is what I call a mosaic. Yeah, you have to look at the greater Middle East, including the Aegean, the Mediterranean, as a kind of mosaic in which there are, from our standpoint, from Israel's standpoint, hostile countries like Iran, increasingly Turkey. I think now we have to add Russia since this war began. That wasn't the situation before then, but it looks very much that way today. And friendly countries. Some of them are Arab, some of them are Aegean. It's a relatively fluid situation. I don't think there's any room anymore to use the term periphery, because I think I would use the term mosaic. We can have relations with Greece, but also with Jordan, with all the difficulties involved, with Morocco, but also with the UAE, maybe with Sudan as well. But at the heart are Egypt and Jordan, our two neighbors who remain at peace with us. And here you can't underestimate the contribution of Egypt to trying to solve this war with regard to Hamas, because it shares our interest in defeating the Muslim Brotherhood as an outcome of this war, without a doubt. I hope that answers you. It's a mishmash, my answer, but I don't think you can't just extract from this some periphery theory and look at the map and say this circle is hostile and the circle beyond it is friendly. It's not. It doesn't look that way anymore. It just doesn't. The Middle East heartland, the Sunni heartland, is friendly. You get to Shiite Iran is hostile, but beyond that is Shiite Azerbaijan, which is friendly. So there's no obvious scheme which can describe this in geometric terms.
Okay. So my second question is related to what you said about Netanyahu and his the way that he survived during the past 6 months. But it's related to foreign policy and Turkish-Israeli relations. During the previous decade, it was a well-known secret that despite the fact that diplomatic ties were severed between Turkey and Israel, economic ties blossomed and kept on going and going and going. So when finally diplomatic normalization was in effect, it seemed that when October 7th happened, and since then, Erdogan has been very careful in what he says about Israel. He seems to not target Israel directly, but more so Netanyahu's government. So it seems to me, at least, and I would like your comment on that in order to get a broader picture. It seems that Turkey does not want to go back to the previous decade with Israel. Instead, Erdogan hopes that in some magical way, Netanyahu will fall from grace, and then Turkish-Israeli relations can move forward without losing any clout on Turkey's side.
That's an interesting thesis. It doesn't ring true to me. I would say for most Israelis, Erdogan is anti-Israel, not just anti-Netanyahu. Okay, he's anti-Israel. He is aligning himself with Iran and Russia. Somehow managing to stay in NATO and get those F-35s or F-16s, but and keeping the economic relationship flourishing. I mean, I enter a store to buy some goods. Everything you buy here is half the things you buy here are Chinese and the other are Turkish. we're flooded with Turkish goods. But Erdogan is seen as anti-Israel. And don't forget, I mean, we're very keenly conscious of the fact that he on October 7th gave his blessings to Hamas and to that attack. And again, this fits into the overall sense of trauma here. And Erdogan comes across as in the Hamas camp, sheltering Hamas off and on. Occasionally he's kicked somebody out. Salah Haruri kicked out to Lebanon. But the Hamas leadership that's in Doha commutes back and forth to Istanbul as well. So, I mean, Erdogan is seen here as part of an anti-Israel alliance, not one that's making war on us directly. In other words, he's not Iran, but he's allied with Iran, and he's allied with Russia, and he made his preference for Hamas and the Hamas cause very plain on October 7th. Now, will he, if Netanyahu first of all, if Netanyahu leaves office, as I said, don't expect him to be replaced by some centrist or leftist peacenik. That's not what's going to happen. So, I mean, if Erdogan needs to be able to focus on some Israeli villain, he'll find the villain. If it's not Netanyahu, it'll be somebody else, and he'll find him. But I would be very surprised if Netanyahu were to. I mean, look, if the impossible were to happen, Netanyahu leaves office, and we make our peace with the Palestinians, and there's some constructive program for rebuilding the Gaza Strip and setting up a Palestinian state, which looks like pie in the sky in present-day Israel. But if that were to happen, I suppose Erdogan would be more friendly and more accommodating. But that's not what's going to happen. That's not where we're heading. And in that sense, I don't see him changing his approach to Israel with or without Netanyahu. I'd be very surprised if he did.
Okay.
Which just, of course, brings us back to Israeli-Greek relations, which, are from the Israeli standpoint, isolated as we are today, all the more important for Israel today. Israeli-Greek relations, Israeli-Cypriot relations, all the more important for Israel today, given the Mediterranean atmosphere and the international atmosphere.
Although, if I remember correctly, it's not a question; it's just a final.
Marina wants to ask though before you close. By the way, if you're closing.
Yeah, we're closing. But
Marina wants to ask a question.
Marina can ask a question. I would just like to say that Israel is well known in terms of foreign policy not to keep all of its eggs in one basket. So, in terms of Greek-Israeli relations, we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, but bear in mind, I think one of the messages of what I'm saying is our basket is getting smaller right now, thanks to this war and to the mistakes we've made.
So we can give Marina the floor for one question.
Yes, thank you, Stavros. Actually, interestingly, my question refers to this basket that you mentioned earlier, and I would like to broaden the picture a little bit from the regional perspective to a more global perspective. And given that, we all know, those involved in the study of international politics, that the international system is undergoing a process of change, a transition to a more multipolar world. And at the same time, as you mentioned earlier, we see that, at least that the picture that we get, the image that we get, that Israel appears to have put all of its eggs, or increasingly so, on the United States. And even though that after the October attack, there was this huge support towards Israel, gradually it started to wane. And we see more and more countries to be critical of Israel. We see countries from the global south to be really vocal, supporting the Palestinian cause, but also China, Russia. We've seen how they have voted in the UN. But even countries like for other rising powers like India, if we see how India has slightly changed, not as much, but we see this change of tone. So my question is, if Israel is concerned by putting all its hopes on the United States, especially given that the power of the United States seems to be decreasing. Of course, it remains a great power, it remains a superpower, but what will happen in 5 or 10 years or 15 years? How will Israel will be navigating the regional politics or the international politics when they will have the support of the United States, but the United States won't be able to help Israel?
Look, it's a good question. I think I alluded to it with my rhetorical questions in my summary earlier. I would say this. I mean, I think your description is quite accurate. If we go back to the period before October 7th, and you were to ask what options does Israel have on the international scene alongside or instead of the United States, the answer would be, well, it has India, it has China, it even has Russia. I mean, note the Israeli-Russian tacit cooperation with regard to Israeli bombing of Iranian targets in Syria. We still have a strategic relationship, but we had a stronger one before this war began. We had more options. We had more options in the Arab world as well. And without a doubt, this war has radically restricted our options. It has put tremendous strains on our relationship with the United States because of, in my view, because of poor Israeli leadership more than anything else. But there are also political dynamics in the United States with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, for example, that would have threatened democratic support for Israel in any case. So, but 6 months ago, we had lots more options. Today, we have a decreasing number of options. The question I would ask is, beyond this war, which will come to an end, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza will come to an end. Beyond that, can Israel revive all of its options? Restore a relationship with Russia, with Turkey, with India, with China? To what extent can it do this? I don't have an easy answer, but my inclination is to think that the world goes back to status quo ante pretty quickly once the catastrophe or the generally the global danger has passed. It goes back to the status quo ante pretty easily. If it doesn't, we've got a real problem because, as you said, we've lost support internationally and we're losing support in the United States. I offered some rhetorical questions as to how to explain this. I certainly pin a lot of the blame on Netanyahu and the Israeli leadership, but there are, without a doubt, other factors at work here as well. I think Hamas would have attacked us even if Netanyahu were not the leader of Israel. we would have, unless our intelligence had done its job and we'd been able to deter Hamas prior to October 7th. October 7th was a catastrophic failure of deterrence, which will go down, I think, in the annals of intelligence failures internationally, along with the Yom Kippur War. But where it's going to end, I don't have a clear answer to your question, but it's a good question and it's one to keep in mind.
Right, we have closed 1.5 hours of a very intensive discussion, and I think we are now finishing. It was wonderful. We had this opportunity to hear you and hear your views and analysis.
Thank you for hosting me. This has been very stimulating. I enjoyed thinking about these issues in order to make this presentation, and I hope this has been helpful and beneficial.
Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much, all of you who joined us tonight, and we are expecting you. Looking forward to the next session. Zakia, what is going to be? Don't we have a clue now, or we are still?
I'm going to leave it for suspense, but it's going to be on the 30th of April, and we're going to announce it in 2 weeks. So, like, giving suspense to the peoples that are following us. But thank you from my side as well.
Okay.
Yeah, go on, Stavros.
I want to thank you as well, and also to apologize to Marina for not presenting her before she talked. Professor Marina Eleftheriadou is a consulting editor at CEMMIS. She is one of the founding members of CEMMIS. So deepest apologies, Marina. And also to remind everyone that probably tomorrow this lecture will be uploaded on YouTube. So for everyone waiting for the next lecture, they can keep watching and rewatching this one to keep them at bay. So that's it for me. And
thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.